Another thing that was different about him is that Hamilton was really not out to line his own pockets. He had vaunting ambition. Like he wanted to be the author of a nation. And he saw a nation as this economic nation. That was redundant to him. That's what a nation is. The crusading finance minister is the hero of modern times to him.
Today, I have the honor of speaking with a historian of the American founding and author of certain books about the early history of the United States. Among these are Founding Finance, Autumn of the Black Snake, and the most recent, The Hamilton Scheme, an epic tale of money and power in the American founding. William Hogeland, thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
Okay, I would like to start by discussing the first letter Alexander Hamilton ever wrote to Robert Morris. The young Alex was writing to him to offer a few ideas about establishing a national bank. But before we get to the bank, I want to ask about the closing remarks of that letter, where Hamilton says, "A national debt, if not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be a powerful cement of our union." What is he talking about? How can debt be a good thing for a nation that's struggling to be born?
Yeah, you're going right to the heart of the
Right.
issue for the Hamilton system right there, and it was not, as you're pointing out, it was not originally just Hamilton's system. It was really Robert Morris's system, in embryo, which became Hamilton's system. And yeah, the public debt of the United States played an enormous role in how they saw it, in cementing wealth and power, the power of wealth to the power of a powerful central government. And that's because the debt they were talking about was really the war debt of the United States. They had to finance war against Britain. And they did borrow from other countries, of course, that had their own beefs with Britain and were willing to lend the U.S. money to fight Britain. But the most important part of the debt for Hamilton and for his mentor, Morris, was the domestic debt. Because this was it was a fair amount of money, but it was loaned to the United States by a small group of wealthy investor types. Ordinary people tried to get in on this at times, and sometimes they did, but mostly the real blue chip piece of this debt was held by a very small group of people, the kind of people who were already speculating in various other investment opportunities like land and so forth. And frequently in the United States, when people talk about the public debt, and even the founding public debt, they talk about it as necessarily just a huge problem that has to be confronted. And they describe the history of Hamilton's history of like, here's this guy, they come out of the war, there's this mound of debt they've piled up and he has to fight it, get it under control. Like that's not how Hamilton looked at the public debt. He saw it as an opportunity because if you have this small group of very rich people who he also saw as the most capable and the most educated people in the country, and they're owed regular interest payments by the federal government, well, then their interest is going to get connected with the interest of the federal government, and they're going to prefer that government over the state governments in certain ways. And this will lead to a coalescing both of government power and financial power, but also in a sense, unify the whole country because we had these 13 separate states that were kind of eager to go their own ways. This was going to be a unifying force. So that's what he's talking about. And he says, as you quoted it, a public debt, if it's not too great. So he qualifies it. He wasn't saying it can just be huge. But in fact, in real life, the size of the debt they were talking about was quite large, considering that the alternative might have been for the federal government to just pay off its debt and have zero debt going forward. But that wouldn't have done what Hamilton wanted.
Right. And so we have this class of rich people who are financing the government. But is that going on during the war? Like, do people have enough confidence in the Congress to lend it money? And what role does Robert Morris play?
Yeah, this was one of the key issues they faced, which is Morris faced as he was trying to use an earlier version of the Hamilton scheme to kind of to bring the country together. First of all, the fundamental fact was they had to raise money. So there is a bottom line. It was difficult because, as you say, there were, as you're suggesting, there were a number of reasons why confidence in the Congress as a payer was going to be weak, which is why they had to offer the rich investors. I mean, it was a patriotic investment on the one hand, of course, but when they first floated this debt, there weren't a lot of takers because they were offering 4% interest, and they were offering it in continental paper, which is the paper currency that the federal government was, the Continental Congress was producing, which was quickly depreciating until it finally went completely bust. So the investors, for all of their patriotism, relatively speaking, whatever, were not very interested in that. They had to end up backing it with French real money, bills of exchange that really were backed by gold and silver. And so that made people confident. And they upped the interest rate to 6%. And of course, that's tax free. So pretty good. Still, there was skepticism among the investing class that this was going to really work, because in the end, the only way to pay that interest, and that's what the investors wanted. They didn't want the debt paid off quickly. They wanted to make 6% a year for a long time, maybe generationally. So in order to believe in that, to have credit, as it's known, um, they needed Congress, the Continental Congress, to be able to collect taxes earmarked for funding that debt. And it was unclear that the Congress was really going to be able to do that. So yes, to your first question, it's going on during the war, and the war didn't go well at first for the United States. So it's just kind of an anxiety ridden situation from a military point of view, from a political point of view. But one of the things I try to talk about is how it was an anxiety ridden situation for the investing class. And Morris's idea was to kind of use that fear, that anxiety, tell them, you've got to demand that the Continental Congress pass taxes, direct taxes on people, in order to fund this. So he was using that investing class, of which he was a significant member and probably the biggest player. He was using that class to try to get the country a stronger, more centralized government with lawmaking powers over individuals throughout all the states.
So, would you say that the project of the bank and the project of federal taxation were went hand in hand, or could
I
one
would.
survive without the other?
They were very closely connected. Could one survive without the other? I think the way Morris saw it and what Hamilton sort of both learned from Morris, but also learned from his own reading in the financial systems of England and France, he believed they went together and that they did go hand in hand, as you say. And the role the bank played then, I mean, Morris was starting a bank, and that's when Hamilton sent him that first letter, which you just quoted. And then later Hamilton, which we'll probably get to, Hamilton did his own version of a national bank. But the interesting thing about Morris's bank, one of the interesting things, is that it was a national style bank in the absence of a national government. They still didn't really have a national government that had lawmaking powers over all the citizens throughout all the states. Continental Congress was a meeting of states that considered themselves sovereign and made laws for their own people. And the Congress did not actually have lawmaking power in that sense. It could pass resolutions asking the states to pass laws, which the states sometimes did and sometimes didn't. And when they did they enforce them? So Morris's idea of the bank was to create a national feeling and a national structure via finance in the absence of yet a national government. And so that's something that's often left out of American histories of the Revolution, because there was this strong financial incentive that precedes, almost as if for Morris, it was like, if we can get a national bank thing, nationhood must follow. So it follows the money, not the other way around. It wasn't like, oh, now we have a nation a little later. What should we do? Should we get a bank? It didn't work like that for them. It was create the bank. If you build it, they will come. Create the bank and nationhood will follow. It was bumpier than that in real life. But that's what Morris was trying to do with his bank, which was called the Bank of North America, which precedes the Bank of the United States, because it precedes the United States as a national government.
So, sounds a bit like saying that you need the body before you can have a soul. That you need to build the institutions before nationhood
Yeah,
can come
yeah.
about. So I wanted to ask, in the absence of direct taxation from this inexistent federal government or national government. Did Morris, um, in a way, see that the practicality of things were either I I turn the war effort into a business that is profitable for me and my friends, let's say, or otherwise it cannot be sustained. And in one way, he paid for a lot of the bills, but at the same time, uh, he was benefiting economically from it.
Yeah, that's right. It's a mixed situation in which you just can't arrive at a perfect, a perfect description because he people say, well, he financed the revolution, and that's
Hmm.
true. He did personally finance it. At the same time, the revolution financed him very directly. And he was flamboyantly corrupt by
Hmm.
modern standards for sure, but even by standards of some people of the day who really had issues with his mingling public funds and private funds with abandon, which he did all the time. The funny question is sort of like, well, but if he hadn't done that,
Right.
would the revolution have been won by the United States? And I think the answer is very possibly no. And so then you're kind of stuck. So apologists for Morris will say, well, he was a little corrupt, but he was basically a great financier. And people who hate him say he was horribly corrupt. He shouldn't have been in charge. But then you end up with a situation where the country might not have come into existence. I kind of try to live with that moral contradiction and just kind of face the facts as I see them at the time.
Okay. Um, but as you explain in the book, there were some people that were not on board with this project of unifying the United States via uh, the money connection, as Morris calls it, the mm, uniting the interests of powerful and rich people throughout the colonies, later the states. There was another group of people that was in charge of the government of Pennsylvania, right? And they didn't see eye to eye with Morris.
That's right. It's a very complicated and dynamic and kind of dramatic relationship that Morris has to what became the government of Pennsylvania. Morris was a Pennsylvanian, a Philadelphian, and that was the dynamic money center of the country at the time. Um, and it's also the political center for obvious reasons, I guess. But it's true that what happened in 1776 in Pennsylvania went very much against the whole Morris approach. They had they threw out the existing government um, in the effort to get the state to support independence. And this was done many places. There were, I don't know, kind of typical governing elites of the day were pro independence. And like in Massachusetts, say, the John Adams type was very radically pro independence, but very anti radical democracy, anti giving ordinary people a major voice in government. Um, so that's more typical of the way the elites were. In Pennsylvania, you have a radical working class, small d democratic revolution against existing structures. And they put in a government that was really strikingly different for the time. I mean, it people could vote in the new Pennsylvania. People could vote, meaning men, free white men over 18 or over 21, whatever I forget the majority age, probably, I don't know. Anyway, majority white males. So it doesn't sound that dramatically democratic to us now. On the other hand, it was radical at the time because they broke the what people then thought of frequently as the ancient connection between property ownership and rights. That kind of right, the right to vote, the right to participate in government, had for a long time in English thinking that many of the founders had adopted, were inheritors of. Um, Rights and property were inherently connected. And so people without property throughout the country often couldn't vote or without sufficient property. And you had to have even more property to run for office. So Pennsylvania threw all that out. And suddenly you have ordinary people in government. You still have this overwhelming power of the rich and powerful, traditional powerful. So you get this really dynamic situation in Pennsylvania where it's the Robert Morris capital. It's the center of the merchant world. It's the center of the financial speculative world. And it's the most democratic place in the country suddenly with ordinary people taking control of government. And it's tricky because, they sent him, uh, he was they kept him as a representative uh, to the Continental Congress, and yet that government was fighting against him all the time regarding his politics and his economics. And it gets violent. It gets literally violent during the revolution. There's also, in that sense, there's been a revolution in Pennsylvania, and it came down to a shooting war at one point between the merchant class and the city militia, of, filled with more ordinary people. So it's very dramatic, and it kind of sums up or distills this issue at the founding of the United States, which is this fight about what kind of country it's supposed to be. Is it going to be what Hamilton really ended up bringing it in, making it as best he could, or is it going to be a more democratic country, more democratic ideas about finance, where we're not connecting government power all the time to the small class of the wealthy? And that fight was going on as a literal fight within the country during the revolution.
Right. So there's two wars going on, so to speak, at the same moment. No? One against the British, and then a class war. That usually it's cold, but it did get hot in at certain points in history. But
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, what was the so now I think that for modern readers of that era, it's hard to distinguish the economic proposals, the currency proposals that one group and the other were putting forward, because we live in a system that, in a way, is the perfect synthesis of the two. Uh, we have a banking system, but at the same time, since the 70s, we have money that is just backed by the confidence in the state, and it's not connected to gold, which was the proposal of the democratic opposition. Um, what was the role of this paper money that the states were printing in this conflict within the U.S.?
Yeah, paper currency plays a big role in this exact conflict, and it's hard now to sort of discuss it clearly because everything's so different now.
Right.
As you say, so it gets hard to track like what the issues are because they're not quite the same as our issues. They resonate with our issues, but they're not identical. Because in those days, as you've noted, I mean, money, bottom line was gold and silver coin, was precious metals. Um, And yet there was very little of that. I mean, certainly none was mined in the 13 English speaking colonies that declared independence. They'd never found it there. So that means that most Spanish silver was actually, the most popular form of money. Um, so that's an interesting position. So what are you going to do when there isn't a lot of it around? And for a number of years, going way back into the colonial period, paper currencies had been issued by governments, the colonial governments, before they were state governments, had issued paper currencies in order sort of backed by gold. So if it says this amount of money on the piece of paper, you're supposed to be able to turn it in ultimately to the state and get that much in gold or silver, more likely. Um, and yet, this paper money has an issue, which has to do with confidence in the state that you just mentioned. Is the state issuing too much of it, so much of it that if everybody came in to try to get metal for their money, the state would all at once, the state wouldn't have enough? Well, if you start to think that and someone and you're selling something, well, then you start to demand more of the paper than you would demand metal. So you're depreciating it informally, really. And this happened. And then other people get word that that's happening. And these depreciations they could balloon, until sometimes a state would have to actually, or a colony for that, would actually have to officially depreciate the currency.
Right.
So, in other words, this paper backed by metal had a tendency to depreciate. It wasn't always some. There's some people like Robert Morris got very very freaked out by paper after a while and felt it was just wiping away the value of investments. But actually, for years on and off, certain colonies had managed it very well by not printing too much of it and by imposing taxes payable in it so they could take it back in. So it was actually not the nightmare and disaster all the time that the merchant class began to think it was or say it was. But it did have a tendency to depreciate, and when not managed well, like the Congress's paper, which was very poorly managed, it would crash. And so, what does this mean to the different classes in that class war we were talking about? I mean, depreciation sounds bad, just generally speaking, I guess you could say, and certainly to the lending class who's lending money. They lent money to the government, but before they did that, they were private lenders. And it was very hard to get a hold of money. So poorer people had to borrow. Artisans, small farmers had to borrow from rich people who had the coin. As merchants, they would take in coin at extremely exorbitant interest rates. What we would think of, usurious in our terms, interest rates. Well, once if they're paying those debts in paper money and it's depreciating, the merchants are getting less and less, is how they feel.
Right.
But on the flip side, ordinary people, they needed a means of just doing small commerce. So they needed paper money. They didn't have the cash, well, the gold and silver. And at the same time, it was a boon to this. Depreciation formed a kind of boon to them. And so you get this class division over paper money itself, where paper becomes kind of the people's finance. And they wanted their governments, their colonial governments and their state governments, to form what they called land banks, issue paper money, also give low interest loans payable with interest payable in paper money to aid small industries, small farming, get people out of debt to private lenders. And that's what they were that's what the kind of small d democracy people were demanding of their states as the revolution was going on and then coming to an end. And we're trying to figure out what kind of country it's going to be. So this class war takes place uh, physically and violently at times, but it's always raging over finance policy in the states and then ultimately in the federal government.
Just very, very briefly, did they actually end up establishing land banks?
There were land banks established periodically throughout the colonial period. Massachusetts did one at one point. Pennsylvania did one or more at different points. They would establish them and then they were more like, they would come and go. But yeah, there's a history of this that's interesting. The historian Terry Boughton has written about this, and he draws on other scholars, um, writing about actually how sometimes there were fairly, I don't know, progressive and ordinary people focused finance policies going on in the colonial governments, colonial legislatures at times. As they weren't always those legislatures were not themselves always super progressive, and the states' rights crowd was not in itself super democratic, but they were susceptible to pressure from below to provide these things. And sometimes it was quite successful. But the merchant class didn't like it because it takes away their customer for really exorbitant loans, for one thing.
So, uh, is it true that for a while banks were not allowed to be established or chartered in the colonies because Parliament was denying them this right? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. The British government at one point, and I forget the year, the British government established a sort of anti-banking policy within the colonies. I think they wanted to centralize control the same way Hamilton would want
Right.
to later. Robert
But in
Morris sort of
London,
wanted to. Right. I mean, um, so yeah, the Bank of England was the favored bank, and they didn't want the colonies starting banks.
mhm.
And it was one of the grievances actually that some of the colonists had.
Okay. So after the war, or at the end of the war, there's this. So the British stop being the main enemy. So there's time to do the class uh, war or battle. And there's this battle for the federal impost, right? That they have this idea that once they pass one tax, America can start existing, because you tie together the interest of the bondholders, and so on. So I I wanted to uh, ask you about this event that it's called the Newburgh crisis. If
Yeah,
I'm
Newburgh, that's right, the
Newburgh.
Newburgh crisis. Yes.
So uh, it's astonishing because in some of the most recent biographies of Hamilton and history of the U.S., this chapter of American history is not, they don't dwell on it. And basically, the story
Right.
you tell is Hamilton was willing was so desperate to make America happen that it was basically planning to use the army to make the impost happen, to advance federal taxation.
Yeah, it's an amazing chapter, and it's really Hamilton's first entry into public life. And he takes some extreme risks because what they were doing was dangerous. Um, the federal impost, this was Morris's idea, basically, and Hamilton too. And Hamilton was at this point a mentor and a protege and partner of Morris, and coming into his circle. And what they wanted to do was they wanted the Continental Congress to pass a federal tax. Because as I've said, the Continental Congress didn't have taxing power, actually. But they wanted to pass a tax and dedicate the proceeds to the bondholders, as you said, as a way of continuing this attempt to cement centralized power and centralized political power and the interests of the small bondholding class. In Morris's and Hamilton's vision, this was how you create a country. What they wanted to do was kind of go incrementally with the Continental Congress. They really weren't looking ahead to what happened, which was, Hamilton kept saying, we might just need to throw this whole thing out and start over with a constitution, create a national government. I think a lot of what Morris was trying to do was, chip away at the state's sovereignty and make the Congress more and more powerful. And then it would sort of morph into a national type government. So the way he saw to do that was to get this tax passed, which required amending the Articles of Confederation, which had very explicitly not given the Congress taxing power. So this was a kind of a fight in the Congress, and it was actually seemed like it was going pretty well for the Morris crowd. Actually, they thought, oh, we're going to get this tax passed. And Morris's idea is once we get one tax passed, we can start having a real slate of taxes here, and it's going to turn into a national government. And then somewhere near almost the last minute, and what the other thing is, they're afraid peace is going to break out. They see the end of the war on the horizon, and their fear is that after that, the Congress will become completely inert. It won't exist as a war-making body anymore. And so they want to get this tax passed. They want to get the Congress on the hook to the investing class before the war ends. And so it's looking good. And then Rhode Island pulls out. And you had to have unanimity on this because they had to amend the Articles of Confederation. Once Rhode Island pulled out, Virginia pulled out, and now they're crushed, the Hamilton and Morris crowd, because they just see it all slipping away. And now it's peace. Now there's going to be peace. And then sort of providentially for them, 3 officers of the Continental Army show up in Philadelphia and kind of walk in like, we're here. We need to get paid, because it was true that neither the officers nor the men had been legitimately paid in many years. It was a total nightmare, partly because Morris was always taking funds and dedicating them to the bondholder class and not paying the troops. So there was a crisis in that sense. And the military was saying, we need to get paid. And what they were really doing was threatening to not lay down their arms once peace came, unless Congress aided them. And this provided an opportunity for Morris and Hamilton and their crowd. They realized now there's a fear of military coup in the Congress. And it seemed pretty real. They realized they could leverage this fear of coup and basically threaten and force the Congress to pass that impost. If they could take the military officer class and make them bondholders too, issue them promises, not pay them off now, do what Hamilton and Morris were always trying to do, which was create a creditor class who were owed money by the federal government. So that's what they did effectively. I mean, it was not a coup. George Washington's role is very interesting because he kind of settled the whole thing down on the one hand. On the other hand, through his very adroit maneuvering, he got Morris and Hamilton and himself, because he agreed with them that this was a good plan, to form turn it into a national government and connect the bondholding class, the public creditors, to that government. Washington was in agreement with them, but he was not in agreement with the kind of chaotic, potentially very dangerous way they were trying to pull this off. he settled it down, but he also told Congress, look, I just suppressed a possible mutiny. It's not over. You need to pass that tax and pay the officers that way. And so they did. And
Yeah.
so there's an argument about whether, was it a coup or was it just
Right.
a threat of coup? And my thing is kind of like, if you're succeeding by threatening a military coup, it's just a bloodless version in a way of a military coup, you could say. There's endless debate about how to read that. But I think what I just said is fairly neutrally factual. Um,
Right.
and in my notes to my book, I do some arguing about it with some of the scholars who disagree with how I present it. And in the expanded notes to my book online, where I go even further, making my case. But it's not just my case. I'm relying on a lot of other scholars for how I present this. And it is, as you say, kind of an astonishing chapter in American Revolutionary history that I think, for pretty obvious reasons, is underemphasized. It's hard to deal with,
Right.
like Robert Morris himself. You
Mhm.
know,
Yeah. And do you think that bring the officers of the army into the fold of the bond holding class, was it um, a determinant factor to let's say increase the force of this faction that later would create the Constitution and establish the U.S.
yes, I think it was. I don't know about determinant, but I think it played a very strong role
Hmm.
in adding the military lobby, the veteran officer military lobby, to what was already a creditor lobby, uh, to get the U.S. some way of paying that interest on the debt, 6% every year for
Right.
years and years to come. Um, and so that's a very powerful thing I mean, literally powerful thing to add. The war was over, but they had enormous prestige. And they formed an organization that is revered in many circles in the U.S. today called the Society of the Cincinnati, and it's not explicitly formed as a watchdog organization for this purpose, but it's a hereditary organization. I mean, its inheritors exist today. The first son in every military officer family is eligible to be a member of it, generation after generation after generation. They were creating, you know, a generational wealth watchdog organization along with a celebratory honorific thing about having won the revolution. So yeah, I think it played a big role. It was a war debt, and it was partly funded because of the lobby of the of the officer class, not the foot soldier class, the officer class.
And one of the events that is usually credited for, you know, motivating the Constitutional Convention is the Shays Rebellion. But you also point to another more discrete event, which happens in Pennsylvania, which is they take away the charter of Morris's Bank. Uh, do you do you think that this was also a contributor and an important one to the anxiety that upscale Americans were feeling about where the country was heading?
Yes, I think the Shays Rebellion is an actual violent rebellion. In Pennsylvania, you get, because Massachusetts tightened up its property requirements for voting, whereas Pennsylvania had opened it up. And so you get very different versions of the same fight, kind of. In the Shayesite situation, they are actually rioting, and then not really just rioting, but actually trying to close down debt courts and so forth. In Pennsylvania, the legitimate government, the elected government, actually withdraws the charter for Morris's Bank, the Bank of North America, the precursor in a way, although it also went on to Hamilton Bank. And this was a kind of a mind blowing act of populist democratic finance policy. They argued, Robert Whitehill, a farmer, and William Findley, a weaver. So two artisans, an artisan and a farmer. Finley had become a lawyer also. But people from a much more working class background were now in government. And they understood better than some of the more sort of, I don't know, state sovereignty elites did, who didn't like Morris either. But the working class people actually understood how this stuff worked better because they were up against it all the time, you know. So they argued very clearly in the Pennsylvania legislature that bank was just a rich men's kind of gambling club. Like they were just writing each other unsecured loans to go speculate in land and stuff. Um, and that the creator, the bosses of the bank were themselves completely irresponsible. And what ended up happening was that didn't benefit ordinary people at large. And Morris was like, "You can't take away the bank's charter. That's the property of." They took away my property. It's confiscatory. And Finley or Whitehill, I forget which one, pointed out, no, it's the property of the people of Pennsylvania, that charter. It's up to us to charter or not charter. This was a terrifying moment because not just in Pennsylvania, but because the bank was located conveniently in Philadelphia. And because it was where the interstate elite, that small group of people who were sort of trying to come together to form something beyond the states, a financial sort of hegemony beyond the states, it's where they put their money and they were invested in it and they were among the bosses of the bank and so forth. And so this, this, this democratic government can come along and say, we don't think this is serving the people. We'll just take the charter away. You can't operate. This was frightening to people throughout the country, combined with things like the Shayesite Rebellion and other popular efforts against the kind of hegemony of a small group of rich people. And the Shays Rebellion, too, was not the only thing like it. There were other uprisings like it, where again, states were being pressured to emit paper currency and make anti-monopoly laws and do all kinds of things that even the states themselves rarely wanted necessarily to do, but they were under pressure to do because of riot and other efforts of organized efforts of ordinary people.
I wanted to ask if the criticism that was levied against banks specifically and uh, the Bank of North America, uh, was it purely part of the politics of the time, or the criticism against the bank itself, carried some weight? Because, or as Hamilton would put it, jealousies and prejudices have circulated. Uh, so while saying it, maybe I'm naive, or I bring my own prejudices to the history. But it seems that the people, the uh, lowercase Democrats, have very strong arguments in favor of anti-monopoly, usury, foreclosure. But when it comes to banks, they seem to say, "I just don't like it because it's the rich people. It's an instrument of the rich."
Yeah, this is a big problem, and it's one of the sort of tensions in the book. I think, you know, is banking in itself actually regressive in the way so many people, more progressive people at the time, believed it was. There's a couple of ways to look at that. One is to remember that the land banks did exist, and that the people were often asking for land banks, the kind that would a state bank that would actually write small loans for low interest rates, very, easy terms, shorter terms, shorter terms, but easier terms, and payable back in paper money. So it wasn't solely anti-banking, the sort of populist movement of the day, but there was a strong prejudice against banks. And, Hamilton calling it jealousies and prejudices, well, that's just how he described any disagreement with anything he did. But, but in this case, there was also a prejudice. And there were some people who felt differently in the popular movement. And this is what has always interested me. Thomas Paine, who I think is misunderstood here a lot of the time as just purely sort of libertarian or something, who was actually very, very interested in democratic finance and in democratic institutions and in empowering ordinary people and even in developing the tools of a welfare state. Yet he thought people were wrong. He thought his kind of colleagues in this democratic populist movement were wrong about banking. He thought central banking could be beneficial to ordinary people if handled right. He was also not a paper money advocate. He got um, why, poorer people preferred a deflationary or kind of depreciating currency because it meant they were paying out less on their loans. but he didn't see that as like a good program for change, you know. So he was anti-paper money and he was kind of pro-bank. He had this weird relationship with Robert Morris, and he actually invested in one of Morris's earlier attempts at banking. So, and yet he just had a unique, he just had his own way of seeing things. And another one of the progressives I talk about, or the populists of the day, who was very forward thinking and is not as well known as Paine at all, Herman Husband. He too, he argued for going off the gold standard or the metal standard completely, which seemed crazy to even his most populist colleagues. He was that advanced in a way, and yet he didn't think that he actually proposed a kind of almost board. There should be a national government with a board. We might call it a federal, you might call it the Fed. I don't know. I don't think he would have liked the way the Fed operates today, but he thought inflation's inevitable and depreciation of currency is inevitable. So like, let's, instead of having a horror of it the way the merchants do or embracing it the way the ordinary people do, let's manage it. Let's manage it. And if we need to like retire certain currencies and issue new ones, we do it, but we do it, in an organized manner. So there were people on the very populist side of the equation who did not fear and loathe centrality and banking. But all too often, I think that prejudice pervaded the populist movement, possibly to its detriment. But then again, when you look at Morris's bank and how it really worked, you can see where if that's banking, we don't want to have any part of that.
I just find it poetic that Herman Husband, the old Quaker, proposing this revolutionary idea of untethering the currency, the gold, and 200 years later, Nixon, the only Quaker president, making it a reality.
That is a really good point that I've never thought of before. I've
Yeah,
never made that
just
Quaker
occurred to
connection
me right now.
before. Yeah, it's
Missing it.
good. It's good. I find her husband's whole sort of way of looking to the future poetic, as you put it. I mean, and people thought he was crazy, and he was very unusual. But if you could envision New Deal type policy like Social Security in the 18th century, maybe you'd have to be a little crazy.
Right. Uh, yeah. What's the difference between a lunatic and a genius? Uh,
Yeah,
only
yeah,
only time can tell.
yeah.
Um, so Hamilton eventually does become in charge of American finances, and the first thing that he does, of course, is to consolidate the public debt. Um, and a year later, he pushes very hard to establish the Bank of the United States. And what I wanted to ask about this subject is it just the Bank of North America Redux? Is it just replicating what Morris's did? Or did he bring something new to this financial system?
Yeah, I think he did bring some new things. He was a student of Morris, but really he kind of went further, and I think he was a more sophisticated student of finance probably than Morris. Another thing that was different about him is that Hamilton was really not out to line his own pockets. He had vaunting ambition. Like he wanted to be the author of a nation, and he saw a nation as this economic nation. That was redundant to him. That's what a nation is. The crusading finance minister is the hero of modern times to him. And so I think he did do some things differently. Also, the situation was totally different precisely because of everything we've been talking about. Hamilton had national powers that Morris was trying to create, lead up to, make happen. But Hamilton had them because in between, of course, what happened was the Constitution of the United States, which I somewhat, I don't know, a little in your face call the Hamilton Constitution in my book, just to try to get people's attention on the fact that people don't think of it as a Hamilton Constitution most of the time, but really the tensions leading up to it. We just talked about the Shays Rebellion, the withdrawal of the bank charter, all the ways that the elite finance class was getting incredibly anxious, so that even people who had opposed a national government got together with the people who always wanted a national government. We got to do something essentially to suppress democracy and ensure the perpetuation of our investments. And to some of them, that's the fundamental basis of the Constitution, was pay the public creditors that interest every year going on and on. So that creates Hamilton's powers. And they were the powers Morris had always wanted. And Hamilton got to have them. And it's a totally different situation. He has to get laws passed that are operative on the entire country, which had never happened before, regarding finance. So he does that, as you said, he consolidates the debt. But getting back to the bank, which was his, first he got the debt. He had a series of steps in his system, and getting that debt consolidated, and getting the U.S. Congress to fund it and to take on all the states' debts within it, ballooning it even
Yeah.
further, was a major project. Immediately followed up, as immediately as he could, by the creation of the first national bank of the United States. It was the first, but it wasn't officially called the first bank as it is now, because then there was a second bank. But at the time, it was the Bank of the United States. And what he brought to that was, he'd always thought that Morris underfunded, undercapitalized the Bank of North America, which is so funny because in his first letter, which you began by reading part of, I mean, he was young and brash, and he wrote to Morris, and he not only was saying we ought to have a national bank, which Morris was already working on, uh, he he also said it should be capitalized at $10 million, which seemed just outlandish to Morris, who had his own, who was pretty big thinking himself. And it was like, that's never going to happen. We can't do that. So one thing Hamilton did, was he did get his bank capitalized at $10 million, which, so that's the Bank of the US. So that doesn't sound like a lot today, but for the country that it was then, it was quite a lot. And even if you do the calculations about what would it be today, that doesn't really tell the story, I think. The story really is that $10 million in money, gold and silver money, was much more than was actually in the country at all. So he did some interesting things there that I don't think Morris would quite have thought of. Like, um, I always have to actually refer to notes on this because I never remember the actual numbers, especially when I'm being recorded. I can freeze up on numbers. But so there were $10 million in gold and silver. That was the idea. But since there wasn't that much gold and silver, he deliberately made it, eight million of that, um, was going to be s- shares to investors.
Hmm.
So, but since they, of course, weren't going to be able to come up with $8 million in coin, he deliberately made it very heavily. I mean, three quarters, I think, of the amount could be bought, of those shares could be bought with those federal bonds that he was trying to shore up, which does a beautiful job in his view. And it really was quite ingenious of shoring up the bonds value, because now to buy bank shares, which a lot of people wanted to get in on, you had to use those bonds. So you had to have bought those too. So that was pretty smart. And the other thing he did, so that's eight of the 10 million largely financed with paper, actually, with US bonds. And then the other 2 million, the remaining 2 million, were to be bought by the United States itself, by Congress, the US Congress now, not the Continental Congress. And again, Congress didn't have that kind of money. So that was written up as a loan to Congress by the bank to be paid interest on for years to come. Um, and so it was a more ingenious kind of way of establishing the bank as a truly national organization, if not totally central, truly national, and yet also a private enterprise, which he really wanted it to be. So these are differences. And the other difference, I think, between his approach and Morris is he always thought Morris's, the banknotes of the Bank of North America were a kind of rich man's currency. As much as they hated paper money, the merchants, they needed currencies too. And their idea was to use large denomination banknotes for that. Hamilton always thought Morris's banknotes were too big, were too high denomination. He wanted this more usable throughout the country. He wanted U.S. banknotes to become the kind of preferred currency at multiple levels of business. And so he lowered the denomination amounts compared to what Morris did. So those are some differences. He took the Morris idea, which is kind of like you can centralize the country around finance, and the bank's going to be a hub for that. It's going to lend the federal government money. It's going to receive taxes, federal taxes. Its notes will be usable for paying any kind of federal centralized, making it the hub. That was sort of Morris's idea, but Hamilton found adroit ways to really make that happen.
Yeah. And he had the power of taxation, which Moritz lacked. Um,
That's what he
wa-
had. Yes.
was it the only way to pay taxes through the bank?
Oh, federal taxes?
Yes.
That's a good question. Was it the only way? I mean, no, it wasn't the only way because when Hamilton instituted the excise tax on whiskey, that tax was not payable to the bank. I believe the proceeds were then taken by the tax collectors and sent to Philadelphia, where the
Mm.
capital still remained at that time, and deposited in the bank. But that wasn't. They weren't. It wasn't like you made out a check to the bank or
Right.
whatever. That was gold and silver handed over to a tax collector at the point of production.
Mm.
Here you go. Then written up receipt, the whiskey made available for market. But then the tax collector took his cut and then sent the rest to the capital, and it would have been deposited in the bank. Yes.
In this financial system that he was creating, probably he thought that everything would go smoothly, but it was not so, right? That there were some excesses in the financial markets that had to be redressed by very modern means. One might call them open market operations.
Mhm.
Can you talk a bit about this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder how smoothly he thought it was going to go. This is a question.
No. Okay.
He took the position that it was supposed to go smoothly, and he might have really believed it and been shocked when it didn't. I don't know, actually.
Mhm.
He was very unhappy when things didn't go smoothly, and he was very disappointed in his own class of people because he'd been trying to use basically the greed, what really could call it bottomless greed of the investor class to leverage this thing, a new country, and he'd be kind of the hero author of it. And of course, they were using him too. So that class was using him. So there was a kind of, mutuality to it. And then when that class's grade gets so out of hand that they just think only short term and they're buying things borrowing money at vast interest rates to buy ballooning bubble stocks and so forth and bonds, everything just went way up too fast. He had oversold it in a sense.
One could sorry for interjecting. Did
No, that's fine.
the Bank of the U.S. participate in this bubble? Do you know if he lent money to prop it up?
Oh, yes. People were buying from the bank, borrowing from that bank and from the
Okay.
Bank of New York and other state banks that were coming along at the time. Yes. So yeah. And so, I mean, it's almost like what's a bubble? This is a bubble. Like it's a
Right.
classic example
Yes.
where the lenders, and private lenders were very into this too, of course. So it isn't just lending institutions that are involved. It's like everybody who had money to lend, was trying to lend it to people for the for the purpose of buying federal bonds, for example, or bank stock in both the federal bank and state banks. So lenders forget that the only reason this stuff is valuable is because they're willing to lend to buy it. And you get this kind of classic bubble situation. Hamilton sees it coming. He knows this can't hold up. So he has to move twice. This happened in pretty rapid succession. So the second one really just sent him into a tailspin. Like, why can't people learn? This doesn't work. He underestimated the short term thinking of the class that he'd known so well. It was his class, really. Um, so yeah, in rapid succession, there were two near failures of the system, which to him would have meant a failure of the U.S. government, really. And he moved in two different ways. He handled each one a little differently. Worse, the second one was worse. He had to, but in both cases, he moved. He took government action to shore up bond market. He felt the bond market was the key thing to shore up. Everything else would settle if the bond market sort of, you know, is partly like, the usual thing. It's going up too high.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, no, it's going too high. But but the reason it's frightening is that it's all going to crash to nothing.
Right.
So he wants it to just, he tries to cool it off. And if it's not going to cool off, he's got to put a safety net under it. And he did all kinds of things. You said modern. I mean, I think modern bailout people have been influenced by Hamilton and U.S. modern bailout people. Timothy Geithner, who was Treasury Secretary with Obama, actually felt personally influenced by Hamilton in his bailout system in 2008. So he was the first bailout guy. And he had to do it. And he tried to do the first one he did sort of subtly, more subtly, because his critics, at this point, Madison, who had been his partner earlier on, Jefferson, the whole Jeffersonian opposition in the governing elite, it's not really identical to the sort of populist democratic opposition to Hamilton, but they just saw the whole system as corrupt because they were interested. They thought money itself was corrupt. They were anti-banking, or at least anti-national bank. And so he didn't want it to look like the only way this system works is if the federal government constantly manipulates the market. But in the end, he kind of had to do that. And
Right.
he made a number of very creative, very adroit, working around the clock kind of thing that in both cases, he did stabilize the situation. The bank did not fail. The bonds did not go bust. And after two rounds of this, he got it fairly more under control. I mean, he started to have other problems in other areas of the system at that point, and it was all kind of happening at once. But so it was a 20, it was all nighters, 24/7 kind of freak out time. But he did actually have to use aggressive or at least assertive political and government means to stabilize the situation.
Just a quick comment to say that there's a line of research or yes, history of central banking or banking more generally that makes a point to say that these kinds of banks, going all the way back to medieval municipal banks, can be considered central banks. We've talked about a bit about it in our group, and there's serious scholars saying central banking doesn't start in London. There's a long tradition of it, and it goes through uh, Philadelphia and then New York. And what Hamilton created was a central bank. Of course, it doesn't have all the features of modern banking. Um, but okay, so um, to get to the point where Hamilton exits the political scene, and his political enemies, not the democracy, but the anti-federalists, get into power, and they try to undo his system. Uh, I, I wouldn't want to get too into the details, but at the end, they almost have a change of heart that they enter government saying we're going to undo everything that Hamilton does. Everything was corrupt, but uh, when in their later years they say, well, maybe we should renew the charter of the national bank. Maybe Hamilton wasn't so bad after all. Well, I don't know if they say this personally of him, but maybe his
Right.
system. So was his system vindicated by by his opponents? How should we look at it?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I don't know that I mean, yeah, certain aspects of his system, I think you could say were vindicated by his opponent's failure to undo them. And in the end, their sort of, I don't know, weak embrace of what he was doing. I mean, the bank in particular, I think, since we've been talking so much about the bank, I think it's really worth focusing there. Um, they made a lot of moves early on, the Jeffersonians, when they came in, and they had major majorities and the presidency for 16 years in that period as the Federalist Party sort of began to dissolve over time. And um, and they came in and they did a lot of things like get rid of domestic taxation, shut down the Internal Revenue Service, and things like that. And Albert Gallatin, who was Hamilton's most important fairly immediate successor, really did everything he could possibly do. I mean, again, 24/7, long nights, trying to whittle down the size of the debt, actually, because they had been anti-debt.
Yes.
And he made great inroads in that and found ways to pay for massive projects that Jefferson never could have imagined himself doing when he took office, like the Louisiana Purchase. And that was only one of them. That was probably the biggest one. But
Yeah.
as this time goes on, yeah,
How did he do it without taking away taxes?
yeah,
Shouldn't he have to, say, let's put 10-year tax on something?
yeah. Jefferson put Gallatin, his Treasury Secretary, in a very tough position because he's like, we're gonna buy this, but we can't have any new domestic taxes. Tech, customs taxes. Okay. Tariffs, what became the tariff, which was sort of like the impost originally. Yeah, that's okay. So Gallatin found ingenious ways. I mean, purchase actually helped bring in more customs taxes because they had the port of New Orleans now. So there's that. But he also did it. I mean, Jefferson couldn't stand this really because without new taxes, then you've got to borrow. That's the only, so we're trying to whittle down the debt. He, and British banking was involved also, which was to Jefferson just anathema and Hamiltonian. But they got the French and the British. I mean, it's very ironic because the French and the British were gearing up to fight Napoleonic Wars. And really, the French needed money to do that, which is why they were willing to sell Louisiana to the
Right.
United States. But French and British bankers got together with American people and worked out this deal. And it's, I detail it in the book. It's kind of ingenious in its own way, not in a sort of an anti-Hamiltonian way. It's kind of ingenious. But that's a top position for a Treasury Secretary. And as time went on, it got tougher and tougher because as Jefferson goes out, Madison comes in, you've got all these kind of young Turk types. That would be the old fashioned cliche for what they would have been called in the day, or maybe since, I don't know. But like a group of young, kind of hot headed congressmen who want, they want, all the benefits of the Jeffersonian model, like no taxes, no debt, blah, blah, no bank. And they want to fight big war with Britain. And they don't care that makes no sense. So Gallatin is really undone in the end by members of his own party, younger generation of his own party, who now see him as just an old wet blanket, forcing everyone to pay as you go and things like that. And so so right on the verge of what became the War of 1812, they withdrew the bank's charter. It was up for, or they refused to renew it. And so on one hand, Gallatin had done some Hamiltonian-like things to keep the country going, and he depended on the bank. So in that sense, it vindicated some of Hamilton's thinking.
Yeah.
In another sense, the sort of hyper Jeffersonians, even Madison said, we should recharter the bank. And he has started out as the bank's major
Amazing.
enemy. So, but yet you've got these younger people in the party who are just, no, the bank is evil. It's unconstitutional. And they refused to renew the charter of the bank after 20 years. Well, that just caused immediate financial chaos throughout the country. And then to declare war against Britain, we have another financial crisis on our hands, a war that really was a war of choice, largely pointless, and created a massive financial meltdown. So in the end, Gallatin had to do kind of a mega Hamiltonian move and go to like the three richest men in America and give them sweetheart deals and access to policymaking, financial policymaking, just to get them to bail the country out. And this is like a very ironic twist, painful for Gallatin, personally painful, I think, but also, an ironic twist on the whole Jeffersonian idea as an antidote to Hamiltonianism. And this is what I kind of came away from doing this book with is like, there was a lot of rhetoric about anti-Hamiltonianism, but in the end, it was kind of a light version of Hamiltonianism that was less effective than Hamilton's because they couldn't rhetorically admit they were adopting his policies. And that's kind of where I ended the story and this kind of oddball collapse. I then do a little epilogue, actually a very long epilogue, where I try to take the whole country from like the end of the War of 1812 up to like almost today, but like in a very quick, with a focus on the whole Hamilton Jefferson binary and what happens to democracy, what happens to Hamilton and Jefferson. But I leave the real story there in a kind of state of meltdown where the whole Hamilton versus Jefferson binary that we are taught is the driving force of the country, isn't really. And the democracy, the old populism that came along in 1776 in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, is also kind of crushed and erased from the story. And that's kind of where I leave it, in a not very happy state.
Mm. So I have a couple of more general questions. And the first one is a very small theory that I want to present to you, and tell me if there's something there or I'm just seeing ghosts. So uh, it's about Hamilton maybe not being so far removed from the democracy's concerns, um, because number one, he promotes the bank as a solution to the scarcity of money, and he takes great pain to say this will multiply the medium of exchange circulating in our economy, which is one of the main um, ails of the people and the economy. He also says that the bank will lessen usury because there will be more money
Mhm.
floating around. Something that I didn't know, but you commented before that he didn't smaller denomination. So uh, and its stock was also in part giving access to the people uh, to financial property. And lastly, um, that the society that he wanted to set up, the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, and all of his concern about uh, turning America into an industrial power was a bit disconnected, maybe. This is my question from Morris's, Washington's, Madison's, Schuyler's interests, which were more in land and in trade, not so much in industry. But it somehow rhymes with the United Company for Promoting American Manufactures that
Mhm.
the radicals set up in Pennsylvania a few decades before. So th- all of the things that I have pointed out, do they like? Do you think there's something there or not?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think, there's a lot of ways you could go with that. So to keep it sort of simple, I guess I'd say, right. I mean, this is one of the places where I think the populist left of the day, whose story is usually written out of our history anyway, but like they existed, as we've discussed, didn't always, I mean, they were right to see Hamilton as promoter of elitism and of having very, very little interest in what ordinary people themselves thought was good for them. He thought he knew what was good for the whole country, including regular people, and that they should all be basically, lined up in a 9 to 5 factory job. Um, and his vision of that factory life was not progressive. It was not cooperative in any way. There was no, unlike the Society for Useful Manufactures, which had a more co-op like quality to it.
Mm,
That was not his vision. Um, and the child labor situation, which they borrowed from England, was pretty brutal. And
mhm.
his vision of, and Washington was in on this too, although Washington, while he was a land oriented guy, was also an industry oriented guy.
Okay.
Um, but then it does, yeah, it does depart from some of the others who were more interested in land. So yeah, the question is kind of like, was Hamilton in some ways right? Or more like, could Hamilton's centralizing approach be adapted to something more, like what the populists actually were calling for, something more democratic?
Mhm.
And I think a person like Paine, uh, and a person like Husband too, had their own versions of that. I mean, Husband built his own version of the Constitution, which definitely involved a powerful federal government in the sense that it would give everybody certain rights at the baseline level. You know, that wasn't Hamilton's idea, but it was another version of a kind of strong
Yeah.
national government. So there are ways in which, over time, these conflicts that seem so dire at the time aren't always construed properly by the people who are in them.
Mm.
And in some historical perspective, you can see some elements where they might have actually been more aligned than they would have thought. Um, but we do have
Was
to keep.
husband also a proponent of eliminating the states as governments?
No, he was not
Ah,
actually.
okay.
He wanted to keep the states, but he wanted everyone throughout the states to have the same basic rights, which was not the way things really were at the time. And that would be controlled by or enforced by a higher federal structure.
Mm,
But he wanted to keep the states. Hamilton wanted to get rid of the states. He knew it was so impossible to do that he brought it up sort of as almost as a joke, but he did admit to it. Um, so, so anyway, I mean, I think there's a lot there. I guess I would say that as I talk about in the epilogue a little bit, there was this sort of, because they didn't have the right oratory to describe it. Later on, liberal America started to talk about Jeffersonian ends by Hamiltonian means. And what they meant, and I don't think this is fair to the original early democracy, really, and it kind of overprivileges Jefferson a little bit, but whatever. That what they meant was democratic outcomes, but using Hamiltonian kind of centralizing power. And I mean, I think the New Deal was it can be seen as framed that way to some degree. It's funny that FDR put Jefferson's face on the New Deal when he was actually amping federal government power beyond anything Jefferson could have abided. But then Jefferson amped federal power too in a way that he was torn about. So all of these things have these kind of resonances now where if people had been able to see a little around the bend, they might have agreed about more things than we think. But I do, just kind of to round that off, I do dissent a bit from this. There's an element, intellectual left element that wants to see Hamilton as kind of progenitor of the American left. And I
Mm,
see why, because it's like dirigisme and government, activist government regarding economic matters. I mean, I
yeah,
get that, but I don't see his aims as being left,
right,
leaning,
right.
broadly speaking.
Um, Another um, relation that I don't know if I'm seeing right or not is that at the time that in the U.S. there's this federalist anti-federalist battle going on. In the UK, there's the Whigs against the more pro-king um, government. That then the French Revolution makes the division very stark. So, is there a parallel between the UK government and the administration of Washington and Adams, and the Whig opposition in London and Westminster, and the Jeffersonian opposition in the US? Is there
Hmm.
something there?
That's an interesting question. I guess I think very broadly, and again, I haven't looked into this in a while, but I think I see the, I see the conflict, the partisan conflict in Britain a little differently. Like, yes, there were Tories self-described and so forth, but I really think conflicts among types of Whigs was more the
Yes, yes,
reality there. So is there a parallel between, say, the Federalists and what they call themselves the Republicans, not the ancestor of today's Republican Party,
right.
really the ancestors of today's Democratic Party, which gets confusing. But they call
Jeffersonian.
themselves Republicans, call them Jeffersonians just for short, whatever. Between the Washington Federalists and the Jeffersonians, does that track with the kind of different partisan conflicts in Britain? I guess maybe. I think what happened though, what's interesting about what happened with the Jeffersonians is that since the French Revolution did come along, as you mentioned, they got very Francophile. They defined themselves not in terms of being like radical Whigs so much anymore as being sort of French revolutionaries, which was kind of at times kind of a
Uh,
style item, like an attitude. It made Washington, incredibly angry and he's sick. Washington actually believed, in terms of this issue about opposition parties, it's very interesting to me that, the founders of the United States are often said to not have understood that parties were going to develop at all, which I find, which may be true. It's a strange dissociation for them because, A, they were members of parties and accused each other of being in parties. And B, they had the whole history of the British partisan situation. And also Washington really felt that any organized opposition to the majority, organized beyond like a one-off protest against a law or something. Yeah, sure, they have a right to do that. Organizing an opposition to the majority, he saw as close to treasonous. He didn't exactly call it that, but he thought it was such a terrible tendency. So in a way, he just believed in kind of majority with no opposition, no organized opposition. I don't see that as exactly parallel, I guess, necessarily to the situation in Britain, but I can't really take it too much further than that.
okay, and then I think this will be the final question, which is about how you try to portray the characters, and in this case, Hamilton, because I think that an American reading it um, and inevitably sees Hamilton in a worse light than he would enter, start at the beginning of the book. But and for example, I saw on Twitter a few days ago, our friends at the Institute for New Economic Thinking said that Hamilton's revolution, the rich win, the rest lose. They summarized it like this. Um, and of course, there is this part, but also someone can see the actions and the impulses of Hamilton, saying, "What a badass!" He doesn't like. I'm gonna create a nation no matter what. I'm gonna use force. I'm gonna use the arm. I'm gonna use political tricks. I don't care. I have this dream, this vision. I'm the hero of my own story. I'm gonna make it happen. So well, I'm not asking about your personal views of him, but more as an author, how you try to balance these things.
I appreciate that question because, of course, everything we're talking about, and it's true in the book too, Hamilton does not come up in an edifying light very, very much. I mean, he doesn't come off as people have to deal with things about him that haven't been, put in their face before and so forth. But the whole reason I'm doing that, I mean, yeah, I mean, the article that you're talking about is like really the only so far, like really in-depth piece in which the book is talked about an interview with me by Lynn Paramore.
I
She
didn't
gets
see
it.
the interview.
She gets it completely at the Institute. Yeah. She gets it completely. Um, and I think it's important, especially for the intellectuals, discussing these matters to have that information and have that angle. For me as an author, though, it's somewhat different. Um, I'm not really, that is those are takeaways from the book. I think that's true. But those are almost byproducts to me of a creative experience that I'm having in my research and then very much in the writing where, I mean, I end up a lot of the time thinking, I mean, about Hamilton, about Morris, about people who were their enemies like Paine, and husband. I mean, to me, it's just sort of like, yeah, they're all pretty badass in certain ways. Like, they all have this vision of themselves and the country that's extreme, very extreme. And it makes for big scale drama to me and kind of, it's an emotional drama in a way, that for me anyway, when I'm working on it in the state where I'm actually, creating it, not just talking about it. I mean, I just, I sometimes just think this stuff's fun, it must have been fun for them. And it must have been very exciting. So when Morris is doing all of his chicanery and stuff, when I'm writing about it, I'm kind of into it because I'm trying to give the reader a feeling for what it might have been like to be in the position Morris was in
Yeah.
and think what you could do. And so that's what I try to do is I can't get in their heads because it's not fiction. I'm stuck with what I can use. But I try to give a feeling for what I think it might have been like, where you could just, I mean, there's some very bad things that happen. There's some tragic things. There's some funny things to me. Some of it to me is funny. And for me, it's just like, I'm trying to give readers a ride they can take, much more than I'm trying to get them to come away with 5 takeaways about how bad Hamilton was or something like that.
Mm. Okay. This was an absolute pleasure. I I came prepared, and even then, I learned many things. So thank you very much. The book, the Hamilton Scheme, will be, uh, the link to Amazon or wherever you want the readers to go buy it will be down in the description. And I encourage everyone to read it because it truly is an epic tale. I really enjoyed reading it. So thank you very much.
An absolute pleasure for me too. Thank you very much.